The sun was setting when Ethan Cole parked his car on the rural road leading to Devil's Tree. He adjusted the camera hanging around his neck and took a deep breath, trying to ignore the uncomfortable weight in the air. There was something about this place, something wrong, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what. Maybe it was just the legend surrounding the tree, or maybe it was the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow all sounds around him. Ethan was a freelance photographer specializing in paranormal phenomena. He had always been fascinated by horror stories and urban legends, and Devil's Tree was one of the most intriguing he had ever come across. Located on the outskirts of Bernards Township, New Jersey, the tree was known for its dark associations, satanic rituals, secret executions, and unexplained disappearances. For many, it was just a local legend, but Ethan wanted to see for himself. The trail to the tree was narrow, covered in dry leaves that crunched beneath his feet. When he finally caught sight of Devil's Tree, a shiver ran down his spine. Its branches twisted like claws pointing toward the darkening sky. The leaves had an unusually black hue, as if they had been stained by smoke. The trunk was thick and covered in deep marks, some natural, others seemingly made by human hands, perhaps knives or nails. Ethan adjusted his camera settings and started taking pictures. He captured different angles, focusing on the details of the trunk and the shadows cast by the branches. Through the camera's viewfinder, the tree looked even more sinister, as if it were alive, watching him. He shook his head, laughing at himself. "You're letting your imagination run wild," he thought. But then, as he reviewed the photos, he froze. In one of the images, a dark figure stood behind him. It wasn't a natural shadow, it was something solid, humanoid, with vague, indistinct contours. He quickly looked around, but there was no one there. The field was completely empty. "This doesn't make sense," Ethan muttered, furrowing his brows. He zoomed in on the image, examining it more closely. The figure seemed to be staring directly at him, leaning forward as if trying to touch him. A chill ran down his spine. Deciding it must have been some kind of optical illusion or reflection, Ethan continued taking pictures, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He could swear he heard distant whispers, even though the wind was completely still. It was as if muffled voices echoed inside his mind, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Curious and perhaps reckless, Ethan stepped closer to the tree trunk. He hesitantly reached out, touching the rough bark. The moment his fingers made contact with the wood, an icy shock shot up his arm. He instinctively pulled back, but it was too late. The whispers intensified, turning into high-pitched screams that rang in his ears. Ethan stumbled backward, gasping, and ran back to his car. That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images of the tree and the mysterious figure in his photos. He dreamed that he was back at the site, surrounded by shadows dragging him toward the trunk. They pulled at him, their hands cold and unrelenting, as he screamed for help. When he woke up, drenched in sweat, he noticed something even more disturbing. There were red marks on his hands, as if something had tried to rip his skin off. Ethan knew he should forget about it, leave Devil's Tree alone. But something inside, and perhaps curiosity, perhaps something darker, urged him to return. He needed to find out what was happening. As he reviewed the photos again, Ethan noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the same image of the dark figure, it now appeared, closer, almost touching his shoulder, and this time he could see it clearly. Its eyes glowed like embers. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. The marks on his hands had darkened, turning almost purple, like bruises that refused to heal. He tried washing them in the bathroom sink, but they wouldn't disappear. On the contrary, they seemed to pulse faintly, as if something alive was moving beneath his skin. "This is impossible," he muttered, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His dark circles were deep, and his eyes were glazed over, as if he hadn't slept in days. But what terrified him the most was the constant sensation of being watched, even when he was alone at home. Determined to find answers, Ethan decided to investigate the history of Devil's Tree. He drove to the local library, an old building filled with the scent of aged paper and polished wood. There he found an archive of old newspapers and historical records about Bernards Township. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon something disturbing. In a yellowed newspaper article from 1892, there were reports of a cult that performed dark rituals beneath the tree's branches. The cult members believed it was a gateway to hell, and that by offering human sacrifices, they could secure protection from evil forces. The article mentioned that several people had disappeared after being seen near the tree, and that any attempt to cut or damage the trunk resulted in tragic deaths. Ethan Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he read the detailed descriptions of the rituals. There were crude illustrations of hooded figures surrounding the tree, with demonic symbols engraved on their cloaks. He copied the symbols into his notebook, feeling more uneasy with each passing moment. On his way back home, Ethan began noticing subtle changes in his behavior. He was constantly exhausted, as if something was draining his life force. Then came the hallucinations. During the day, he saw shadows moving quickly in the corners of his eyes. When he turned to look, there was nothing there. At night, the whispers returned, echoing in his mind even when he tried to focus on something else. A close friend, Matt, noticed something was wrong. They met for coffee, and Matt couldn't help but comment on Ethan's deteriorating state. "Dude, you look terrible. What's going on?" Matt asked, frowning. Ethan hesitated before answering. He knew the truth would sound insane, but something inside him needed to share the weight of what he was experiencing. "I went to that tree, Devil's Tree. I touched it, took pictures. Since then, strange things have been happening. These marks appeared on my hands, and I keep seeing things that aren't there." Matt frowned even more, clearly worried. "You need to let this go, Ethan. These legends are dangerous for a reason. Maybe it's best to drop this project." But Ethan was already obsessed. He knew he couldn't just walk away from Devil's Tree now. That night, he decided to return to the site to take more photos. He wanted to prove to himself and to Matt that he wasn't losing his mind. When he arrived at the tree, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The wind blew cold, despite the clear sky. Ethan walked slowly toward the trunk, his camera ready. That's when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Embedded in the trunk was an old medallion. It was made of dark metal, etched with the same symbols he had copied from the library. With trembling hands, Ethan picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the object, a sharp pain shot through his body, as if 1,000 needles were piercing his skin. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, as a rough, distorted voice echoed in his mind. "You have been marked." Ethan dropped the medallion immediately, but it was already too late. He felt something crawling beneath his skin, as if tiny creatures were moving inside him. When he looked at his hands again, the marks had grown darker, larger, and they formed a pattern he recognized from the demonic symbols. He knew he was in trouble, deep trouble. Ethan knew he needed help, and fast. The marks on his hands were spreading, crawling up his arms like black vines. He could barely sleep, and when he did, he was haunted by vivid nightmares. In each dream, he saw people being dragged into the Devil's Tree, screaming for help as shadows consumed them alive. He would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that these visions were not just creations of his mind. That's when he remembered someone who might understand what was happening. Dr. Evelyn Hart, an expert in the occult and paranormal phenomena. He had read an article of hers years ago where she discussed similar cases involving cursed trees and ancient rituals. Although hesitant to share something so personal, Ethan knew he had no other choice. He sent her an email detailing his experience and attached the photos he had taken, including the image of the demonic medallion. To his surprise, Evelyn responded quickly, asking to meet him in person. The next day, they met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Evelyn was a middle-aged woman with gray hair tied in a tight bun and piercing eyes that seemed to see through people. She examined the photos in silence, her fingers tracing the symbols etched into the medallion. "You have been marked," she finally said, her voice low and firm. "These symbols are part of an ancient pact. The Devil's Tree is not just a tree, it is a portal to hell. And now you have been chosen as the next victim." Ethan felt a knot form in his throat. Chosen? Why? "I'm not sure. It could be because you touched the trunk or because you took the medallion. The important thing is that the tree is feeding off you. If nothing is done, your soul will be completely consumed. Is there anything I can do?" Ethan asked desperately. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "There is a containment ritual. It's dangerous and requires specific materials, but there is a price, a sacrifice. Someone must enter the tree to seal the portal permanently." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to believe Evelyn was wrong, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. He agreed to try, knowing he had no other option. Over the following days, Ethan and Evelyn gathered everything they needed: black candles, rare herbs, a protection circle drawn with white chalk, and the medallion he had found. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to feel the effects of the curse. His hallucinations worsened, and he began seeing distorted faces in the walls of his home, whispering his name. He knew time was running out. The night before the ritual, Ethan received an unexpected unexpected visit. He was reviewing Evelyn's instructions when he heard a soft knock at the door. When he opened it, he saw a hooded figure standing at the entrance. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed like embers. "Do not interfere with the tree," the figure said, its voice echoing like a distorted chorus. Before Ethan could react, the figure vanished, leaving him alone again. He immediately called Evelyn, who confirmed his suspicions. "They know you're planning something. The tree is testing you. You need to be strong, Ethan. If you falter, you're lost." On the day of the ritual, Ethan and Evelyn arrived at the Devil's Tree at dusk. The air was thick with negative energy, and the wind howled fiercely despite the clear sky. They began setting up the protection circle, positioning the candles and burning the herbs. Ethan placed the medallion in the center of the circle, shivering. As he touched it again, when everything was ready, Evelyn handed Ethan a paper with the incantations written on it. "Repeat exactly as it is here. Do not stop, no matter what happens." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling as he held the paper. They started the ritual, reciting the ancient words in Latin. As the ritual progressed, the air around them became heavier, and the tree's branches began to thrash violently, as if resisting an unseen force. Then, something emerged from the ground. Thick shadows took shape, transforming into humanoid figures with glowing eyes. They surrounded Ethan, trying to drag him into the tree. Evelyn fought to keep him safe, shouting for him to continue the incantation, but Ethan knew the ritual required a final sacrifice. He looked at Evelyn, who shook her head in warning. "Don't do it," she said, her eyes filled with concern, but Ethan had already made his decision. The wind howled around Ethan as he struggled against the shadows, trying to drag him into the tree. His hands trembled, but he kept reciting the incantations, his voice nearly lost in the rising chaos. The branches of the Devil's Tree twisted like enraged serpents, hurling black leaves into the air. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate, as if the very earth was alive. Evelyn stood beside him, clutching one of the black candles and shouting for him not to stop. She traced symbols on the ground with white chalk, reinforcing the protection circle as the shadows pressed in, but they were relentless, their dark forms gaining more substance with each passing second. "Keep going," Evelyn shouted, her voice nearly drowned out by the roar of the wind. "You have to finish." Ethan felt something grab his ankle, an invisible hand, cold as ice. He staggered, nearly falling, but managed to stay on his feet. The shadows now had faces, twisted and tormented, screaming in silence as they tried to pull him toward the tree's trunk. He recognized some of them people who had vanished over the years, victims of the curse. Then a voice echoed in his mind, distinct from the others. It was calm, almost gentle, yet carried an undeniable authority. "Enter," the voice whispered. "You have already been chosen." Ethan hesitated, paralyzed by doubt. He glanced at Evelyn, who was visibly exhausted, drenched in sweat as she fought to keep the circle intact. He knew she couldn't hold on much longer. "There's no other way," he thought, resigned. With one last look at Evelyn, Ethan made his decision. He let go of the paper with the incantations and stepped toward the tree. The shadows withdrew slightly, as if surprised by his choice. Evelyn screamed behind him, but he didn't look back. "Don't do this, Ethan," she pleaded, her voice filled with desperation, but it was too late. Ethan placed his hands against the tree's trunk, feeling the same icy sensation he had before. This time, however, it was more intense, like 1,000 needles piercing his skin. He closed his eyes and began to whisper the final words of the incantation, his voice steady despite the terror gripping him. As he spoke, the medallion at the center of the circle began to glow with an intense red light. The shadows around the tree started to dissipate, like smoke blown away by the wind. The trunk of the Devil's Tree trembled violently, and Ethan felt an irresistible force pulling him inward. "Now, Evelyn," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar. Evelyn completed the ritual, drawing the final symbol on the ground. The red light exploded into a blinding flash, and the portal began to close. Ethan felt his body being sucked into the tree, but he knew he had done his part. The portal was sealed. When the light finally faded, Evelyn was alone in the clearing. The Devil's Tree looked different. Its branches were still twisted, but now they seemed lifeless, as if they had lost their malevolent energy. She ran to the trunk, searching for any trace of Ethan, but he was completely gone. However, something unsettled her. Around the base of the tree, small black sprouts had begun to emerge from the soil, growing rapidly. They pulsed faintly as if alive. Evelyn heard a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the tree. Until next time, she ran, leaving leaving the place behind. But as she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that the curse of the Devil's Tree was far from over. You thought it was over, but the Devil's Tree still holds its secrets. The black sprouts keep growing, pulsing like living veins beneath the earth. They are waiting, watching, ready to choose their next victim. If you felt the weight of this curse, if the whispers echoed in your mind just as they did in Ethan's, then this is your chance to dive even deeper into the unknown. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every story here is a doorway to terror, and some doors should never be opened. Enjoyed the video? Leave a like. Your energy feeds this channel and helps others find the Devil's Tree. Comment below. What do you think happened to Ethan? Did he escape, or was he consumed by the darkness? Thank you for watching. If you love stories that make you question reality and send chills down your spine even after the video ends, you've come to the right place. Subscribe and become part of our community of fear seekers. Turn on notifications to be alerted when new videos are released. After all, the Devil's Tree is always watching.